University of Chicago. He completed an MA and PhD at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University. His main area of research is Islamic theology, with a particular emphasis on the Salafi tradition of Sunni Islam, from Ibn Taymiyyah to present-day Salafi movements. To date, his principal contributions to the research literature are two books on the intellectual history of Salafism, pre-modern and modern radical Islam, and the revival of medieval theology in Cambridge University Press, 2012, and Salafi political theology, also in Cambridge, 2025. Mazal tov.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Took off the last few days, so I'm going to try to hold it in, but please bear with me if there are a few interruptions here and there. So the topic of my talk today is, have the Muslims apostatized or just their rulers? That's, of course, not my question. That is drawing the boundaries of faith in radical Salafism. That is, in the eyes of present-day radicals, are the Muslims apostate or just their rulers? Now, the assumption in this question is, of course, that somebody has apostatized, right? That's not a necessary assumption. There's no reason to think ill of others, perhaps a great many. And it's just an issue of how many and why. Specifically, I will address this question as it is posed and answered in the radical branch of the Salafi school in the present day, in light of the pre-modern and modern precedents that have influenced them. So these Salafis are often called Salafi jihadis or jihadi Salafis. For today's purposes, I'll stick to the language of radical Salafis or radical Salafism. So I will delve into all of the various elements of this issue, but I would first like to set the stage with two passages, two quotations. The first is from Sayyid Qutb, who was an Egyptian leader in the Muslim Brotherhood until he was executed in 1966. This is a very famous picture of him in prison. And he was from the Muslim Brotherhood, but his major posthumous influence is on radical Salafis, which is why he is relevant to us. And we'll get back to that. So in his commentary on the Quran, his Quran exegesis, Izilal Quran, we have this passage. Time has come full circle to the point it was at when this religion came to humankind, and humankind has returned to something like the position it was in when this Quran was revealed to the Prophet, Allah's prayer and peace be upon him, and the time when humankind encountered Islam as it was based on its foremost principle, the testimony, La ilaha illallah. Okay, and that is, of course, the Muslim profession of faith. For the time being, I'm leaving it untranslated, and we'll see why further on. This testimony, La ilaha illallah, in its meaning as explained by Ribi bin Amir, who was a companion of the Prophet, the envoy of the commander of the Muslims to Rostam, commander of the Persians. He's talking about the lead up to the Battle of Qadisiyah, which was the decisive battle that brought down the Sasanian Empire. When the latter asked him, so Rostam asked Ribi, what brought you here? And Ribi answered, Allah sent us to deliver whosoever wishes from servitude to humans, or worship of humans, ibadat al-ibad, to servitude to Allah alone, from the straits of this world to abundance in this world and the next, and from the injustice of the religions to the justice of Islam. He knew that Rostam and his people, that is the Persians, did not worship Khosrau as a creator god, nor did they offer him the known forms of ritual devotion. They only received laws from him, and thus worshipped or served him in this meaning. That is, what is the meaning that Ribi has come and the Muslims have come to liberate people from ibadat al-ibad, servitude to humans or worship of humans? This is what it means, that they received laws from the ruler. Time has come full circle to the point it was at when this religion came to humankind with La ilaha illallah. Humankind has apostatized or reverted to servitude to humans or worship of humans. Humankind in its entirety, including those who constantly repeat from the minarets in the East and the West, La ilaha illallah, bereft of meaning or reality. It is they who incur the gravest sin and who face the harshest punishment on the day of resurrection, for they have apostatized or reverted to servitude or worship of humans after guidance was made clear to them and after they had been in Allah's religion. a very famous passage from Sayyid Qutb. Now, I would like to juxtapose it with this second quote, which is from the earliest and most important Wahhabi chronicle written in recounting the events of the mid-18th century. It was authored in the early 19th century. Ibn Ranam was a court historian with the Wahhabis in the Wahhabi capital. So this is his account of the rise of the Wahhabi mission. The introduction is called The Condition of the Muslims on the Eve of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's Mission. At the beginning of the 12th century, that is the turn of the 17th century of the Common Era, most Muslims had regressed into shirk, idolatry, and reverted or apostatized to Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is the traditional term for the period of pre-Islamic heathenism, specifically in the Arabian Peninsula, but it can refer to any form of society before it's received a prophetic mission. The light of guidance was extinguished in their hearts as they were overtaken by ignorance and the rise of the heretics. They cast aside the book of Allah and followed instead the misguidance of their fathers, for they thought that these fathers were more knowledgeable of the truth and the correct path. They turned to worship of the saints, awliya. They turned to worship of the saints and the righteous, dead and living. They requested aid from them in the face of mishaps and unfortunate occurrences, and relied on them to fulfill their requests and relieve their sufferings. So we have two depictions here of widespread, near universal apostasy. Sayyid Qutb's depiction is probably the better known one. Much has been written of his use of the concept of Jahiliyyah, or the new Jahiliyyah, and his claim that the entire world had reverted to Jahiliyyah, had reverted to un-Islamic heathenism. And in the passage that we saw, he specifies why, by comparing the state of the world in the 20th century, including and especially in the Muslim world, therefore his reference to the minarets, to the late Sassanid Empire. The Persians did not believe in Khosrow as a creator god, nor offer him ritual devotion. They merely accepted his laws, the laws of the state, in preference to the law of Allah. That is why Qutb is so fond of that anecdote, which he mentions in other places as well. So what Qutb describes is a near universal legal political apostasy of obedience, preference for human kings over the divine one. And on the other hand, we have a depiction of widespread near universal apostasy in the 18th century from a court historian of the first Saudi state. And there the cause of apostasy was the worship of human beings alongside or instead of Allah. In other words, ritual polytheism. And I'll take a breath. So this sets the stage for everything that will follow. I'm going to try to explain the relation between these two conceptions, ritual polytheism on the one hand and political polytheism on the other. So now perhaps is the moment where I should explain what Salafism is. When I began researching these topics about 2 decades ago, there was very little research on the academic research on the topic of Salafism, and in public discourse, the term was not really familiar. Today it is, one hears it in the news, and so forth. But most of the discussion back then was about the ideology of Al-Qaeda and the like. And it took a while for people, including myself, to understand the intellectual origins of Al-Qaeda and other like-minded groups. And likewise, the relation between their religious intellectual orientation, radical Salafism, and that of their Salafi contemporaries who share much of their same creed, but who are conservative and nonviolent in their religious praxis. And just to ward off any misunderstanding, in the past, Salafism was sometimes a term applied to a form of Islamic modernism in the late 19th and early 20th century, represented famously by Muhammad Abdul in Egypt and Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in British India. Of course, he wasn't born Sir, he was knighted afterwards, so that gives some indication as to his orientation. This is not what I'm talking about, so forget about them. And my own study of Salafism is primarily in the prism of intellectual history, or at least we can consider it intellectual history. There is also a conceptual history of Salafism, which bores down on the use of the term itself and the meanings that it is held from in the 20th century and 21st century. So these are two different things. I'm not especially concerned with why we're calling Salafism Salafism, but I will address what it means. So Salaf, from the verb salafa, means the righteous, the forefathers, those who went before, and in this context, the righteous forefathers. There is a prophetic tradition that is closely associated with this concept. The best of people are my generation, that is the Prophet Muhammad speaking, then those that follow them, then those that follow them. Okay, so the first three righteous generations of Islam. Today's Salafis are heir to a millennium-old tendency, more or less, in pre-modern Sunni Islam, and one which has persisted throughout the years as a minority view within Sunnism. That is, it was distinct from and opposed to the prevailing currents in Sunnism, and it claimed to represent true Islamic doctrine in opposition to the majority trends which had allegedly corrupted true Islam, Islam as it existed in the time of the Prophet and his companions. Now, this holds both for the general ethos of the Salafis. So first of all, there's a general ethos, and then there are concrete positions in theology, law, and ritual praxis. So that is regarding the term itself. And here is a very schematic representation of Salafism, focusing for the time being on theology, which in their language is either Aqidah or more often Tawheed. So I have distinguished between three different strata here. The first is early Hanbalism, or also known as Ahl al-Hadith, literally the people of the Hadith or the Hadith folk, and sometimes called traditionalists in scholarly literature. And what represents their ethos, or one can sum up their ethos in literalism, rejection of speculative theology. The term that, or the phrase that perhaps best sums it up is Itiba al-Quran wa Sunnah al-Fahmi as-Salaf as-Salih. That is, adherence to the Quran and to the traditions from the Prophet as these were understood by the righteous early generations. So we are talking about a trend that is scripturalist, literalist, originalist. That is, the Salafis purport to derive both legal decisions and dogmatic positions from the sources of revelation to the exclusion of any other source. And to the extent that these sources require human interpretation, as sources often do, then they will go to what is called a tafsir bil ma'thur. That is, they will look to the interpretations offered by the first three generations. That is, you can't just make something up. It has to be documented. In addition, they held that one should not even engage with the heretical sects at all, certainly not on their own terms. That is, one should not engage in rational defense, even of this worldview, but to engage in a rational defense and to employ the terminology of the heretical sects does nothing except to weaken one's faith and cast doubt in the heart. And so that is the first stratum of Salafism. From here on, I'm going to describe much more specific features of pre-modern Salafism and ones that set the stage for our topic of apostasy in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, while the ethos of Salafism is as I described, in practice, and this is perhaps a little bit ironic, there is an expectation, a very strong expectation, that one fall in line with the dogmatic positions of a medieval Syrian scholar by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah. And we are going to bore down on one doctrine of Ibn Taymiyyah that is especially significant, and in my opinion is the core of his entire system as well. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah strayed from this early ethos in an important respect. He did engage with the heretical sects, or some of these are mainstream Sunnism, historically speaking, but in the eyes of Salafis, heretical sects. He not only engaged with them, he did this apparently with a lot of joy and verve. He employed their terminologies to argue against them. I like to think of it almost as though he's a sapper. That is, he goes behind enemy lines in order to sabotage the enemy. he tries to explode the other systems from within and to demonstrate that what they say is philosophically necessary is not philosophically necessary. What they say is necessary to believe of Allah is there's nothing that requires us to believe that. And then once he's cleared the path, then he opens up to the traditional Salafi ethos of receiving everything from revelation. In addition to that departure from, well, before I get to that, so just on one foot, as one says in Hebrew, in a nutshell, so here are some examples of the traditionalist positions that Ibn Taymiyyah defends, just to emphasize his traditionalist side. One must affirm and believe in God's attributes as they were related by God himself and his prophet, and not reduce them to allegorical status. Acts or works are a full and necessary component of faith, alongside belief in one's heart and profession of the tongue. This already hints that it might not be enough to say the profession of faith if one performs acts that contradict it. That will factor in what follows. How do we know God? Knowledge of God is implanted in human nature and stands in natural correspondence with God's self-revelation, both through his works in the cosmos and in his scripture. And thus the existence of God does not require any rational or syllogistic proof. Ibn Taymiyyah attacked what we might call ontotheology, that is, the confusion between metaphysics and divinity. For him, God is not being per se or anything of that sort. God is a particular being with particular attributes, distinguished by these attributes from other beings. He is spatially transcendent and not immanent to the world in any way in his selfhood. He is separate from the world and exercises lordship over it. That is the primary relation. The Lord-servant relation is not the primary, the only relation between God and creation. Okay, all of those are more or less traditional positions, and alongside them, Ibn Taymiyyah brings this terminology, which is for the most part novel. That is, the various claims that have been put forward for precedents for this are very weak, whereas this is very central to Ibn Taymiyyah's system itself. So let us focus in on these two terms, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah and Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah. Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, these are, well, before I explain them a bit more, then I just want to prefigure so that I can go on to the next slide. In the 18th century, I mentioned Wahhabism, and we saw the passage from the Wahhabi chronicler. Wahhabism is basically just Taymiyyah doctrine in the flesh. Okay, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, it's very easy, well, not very easy, but one can, if one reads enough, demonstrate easily that his doctrine is entirely derived from Ibn Taymiyyah, and in particular, this distinction between conceptual monotheism and monolatry. So, excuse me, let's discuss a little bit more what he calls the two forms of Tawhid. Tawhid I have left untranslated because it is normally translated as monotheism, but we'll see that that's not entirely appropriate here. Hebrew is a bit better here because one can say Yichud Hashem, and it's not clear which meaning one means, as in the Arabic Tawhid. So, Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, or conceptual monotheism, Rububiyyah is an abstract noun from the word Rabb, and Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah is to recognize Allah alone. The meaning of Tawhid for Ibn Taymiyyah is basically to ascribe to or to give to Allah alone, to the exclusion of all others. So in the conceptual sense, one needs to recognize that Allah is creator and master. And that is contrasted with Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah or Ilahiyyah, also known as Tawhid al-Ibadah, which just like the Hebrew avodah means worship. Okay? And this is not really monotheism. This is more monolatry from latreia, service or servitude or worship. So the exclusive worship of one God, just as Rububiyyah is an abstract noun derived from Rabb, so Uluhiyyah, or occasionally Ilahiyyah, is an abstract noun derived from another word for God, Ilah, which is a cognate of the Hebrew Eloha, but which is defined not just by Ibn Taymiyyah, but he is the only person for whom this is so important. Excuse me, defined as ma'bud, or an object of worship. So Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, if Tawheed is to give exclusively to God, then Tawheed al-Uluhiyya is to devote one's worship to Allah alone without partner. Now, the most radical element in this conception, Ibn Taymiyyah's contention, is that Tawheed al-Uluhiyya is not, as one would say in Yiddish, it's not Groise Chochmah, right? Everybody knows Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, including not just Muslims, not just Jews, not just Christians, just about everybody. He writes at one point that people differ on the details. Now, he's written volumes and volumes about these details, so we need to take that with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that it's the things that I discussed before are unimportant. That is, for example, that Allah is spatially transcendent and not omnipresent in the world. That's very important to Ibn Taymiyyah, but yet it is less important than Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, which is the true distinguishing line between Muslims and non-Muslims. Tawheed al-Uluhiyya is the telos of creation, the purpose of creation. He likes to cite the Quranic verse, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ. Sorry, it doesn't start with the wa, right? مَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونِ. I only created the jinn and humans so that they worship me. Allah speaking, of course. And it is likewise the message of all of the prophetic missions, right? The prophets were sent to people who were essentially monotheists. And to tell them to restrict their worship of God, to restrict their worship to the one God, creator God, whom they already recognized, okay? And to stop appealing to other entities who act as intermediaries or intercessors with Allah. So, in Ibn Taymiyyah's view, the message of the Quran, the message of the prophets, is really more to cut it out with the cult of saints. It is not, there is one God who did this and that. There are those elements as well. But again, the portrayal is prophets who come to people who are monotheists, but who do not restrict their worship to one God. They are polylatrists, if one wants to say.
Were those terms used before Ibn Taymiyyah?
Hardly at all, no. So if one wants, that's what I meant when I say, various people tried to present precedents, because it's a little bit embarrassing to say that Ibn Taymiyyah invented a doctrine, right? So no, but for the most part, the terminology is to use it regularly and to make it central to theology. I'm not aware of any precedent. And in truth, as I mentioned before, where Ibn Taymiyyah strayed from the primitive Salafi ethos of not arguing with the heretics, a lot of this is built in dialogue with Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and with various Sufi orientations. So the short answer is no. But if one wants, Tabari does have some things that are in this direction in his tafsir, but there is very little precedent, one can say. So, in what sense then was the Wahhabi movement, which arose in the Central Arabian Peninsula in the 1740s, Taymiyyah doctrine in the flesh, as I called it? In this sense, the movement's founder, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, adopted Ibn Taymiyyah's Tawheed al-Uluhiyya doctrine as its central raison d'etre and as its primary casus belli in a war launched and waged for the sake of eradication of the cult of saints. This is very important because it is an emphasis that is very clear in Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings themselves. So it won't really do to say, well, he was interested in this and he was interested in that and he was interested in that, even if he was, because that is not how he presents himself. He presents himself as having one sole preoccupation and one sole point of contention between himself and his movement and those he opposed. And he says the point of contention was always the restriction of worship to one God alone, Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, monolatry. Okay? So it's a doctrine taken from Ibn Taymiyyah. It's ridiculous that there's still some debate about this in the literature. There should not be. And so what are we talking about with the cult of saints? It already existed in Ibn Taymiyyah's day. Actually, Daniela can tell you more about the details than I know. But by the 18th century, it was certainly far more widespread. In the Arabian Peninsula, as well as many other places throughout the Muslim world, one could say that the primary form of quotidian, day-to-day religiosity that Muslims practiced was the cult of saints. Okay? They might be very punctilious about other prayers or not, or other obligations or not. But the cult of saints was kind of the bread and butter of everyday religiosity. The center of this are forms of tomb-centered devotion to the awliya, that is, to the saints, or the salihun, the righteous, or at the tombs of prophets, or what are claimed to be tombs of these people and are not necessarily. There was also appeal to people, so-called living saints, but most of it is with respect to the dead. So what were these various practices? The saints were petitioned, dua, that is, to address a request to a saint. Ibn Abdul Wahhab likes the prophetic tradition, dua mukh al-ibadah, that is, the dua to address a request to somebody. That is the heart of worship. That is the marrow, like moah, of worship. People also offered them sacrifices, circumambulated their tombs, vowed by their names, and all of these were practices that the Wahhabis saw as polytheistic practice in the simplest sense. Literally the same practices that were engaged in by the polytheists to whom the prophets in the Quran were sent, in order to bring them back to exclusivity of worship. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab and his friends said, that is our mission as well. That is the telos of existence. That is the prophetic mission. And we need to eradicate this cult of saints and bring people to worship of Allah alone. Along the way, they happen to have found the first Saudi state, which is still with us in its third iteration today. Importantly, this definition of ilah comes into play in the profession of faith. You remember I left it untranslated in an earlier slide. La ilaha illallah. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, for Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and for modern Salafis, the meaning of the profession, the Muslim profession of faith is no, there is nobody worthy of worship apart from Allah. It does not mean there is no God apart from Allah in another sense, because again, that is something that they believed is nearly universally held, is that there is no object of worship, no object worthy of worship apart from Allah. And of course, the meaning of the profession of faith is not a small consideration. That is how one becomes a Muslim. It's repeated daily in prayer. It is held to express the essence of the Islamic faith, and that is what it means for them. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab's contemporaries often complain, well, you're killing people who say La ilaha illallah, and he would say they contradict it with their acts through the cult of saints. And here is a good illustration of this from Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself. If it is said, there is no Khaliq, creator, but Allah, then that is known. No one creates the creation but Allah. Likewise, the meaning of no one provides provision but Allah. That is known. Likewise, if it is said, La ilaha illallah, then this means something specific. So reflect on this. May Allah have mercy on you and inquire about the meaning of ilah, just as you inquire about the meaning of al-Khaliq, creator, and al-Razik, provider. Know that the meaning of ilah is an object of worship. So that is the reason why the early Wahhabis viewed their contemporaries as unbelievers and polytheists. And since they did not understand that an ilah is precisely an intermediary and an intercessor with Allah, they didn't understand that they were in essence mushrikun, polytheists, whereas of course they consider themselves Muslims. They were born with Muslim names. They might perform the pilgrimage and the canonical prayers. That wasn't important to Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Then you could pray all day long if you want, but if then you go and petition a saint, then you've taken two ilahs. What can I do? Okay, so that is the pre-modern heritage to which present-day Salafis are heir. Now, we've seen a basis for considering other self-professed Muslims to be unbelievers or apostates who must be fought. But the concerns of today are not the concerns of yesteryear. I mean, to the extent that the cult of Saint Sadayan still exists, mixing up languages, it's still a concern. Okay, so Salafis to this day will destroy tombs and so forth, but not to the same degree. It is not their primary focus as it was for the early Wahhabis. The radical Salafis, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS, are far more concerned with the kind of political polytheism that we saw described by Sayyid Qutb, the polytheism of obedience to human law. So this notion that Muslim societies and or their governments well, if it's the societies, then it's the governments as well. If it's the governments, it's not necessarily the societies. I'll get back to that. But the notion that Muslim societies and or governments have in fact reverted to a kind of political polytheism that arose in force only in the 20th century and is due not so much to internal development of the Salafi tradition, even though the potential was there. It's mostly due to the impact of two influential authors. First, the Indo-Pakistani Abu al-Ala Maududi, who was first, and then the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, who we've already met. They were approximately the same age. Maududi was only born 3 years before Qutb, but he crystallized his thinking from the mid-1930s, and definitely by the early 1940s, it was already fully formed. Whereas Sayyid Qutb began his career as a literator, a literatus. That is, he was an author and a literary critic, and only slowly he became closer to the Muslim Brotherhood. And then even after that, he went beyond sort of the traditional Muslim Brotherhood thinking to these more radical ideas towards the end of his life, largely, and in my opinion, mostly under the influence of Maududi. So those are both 20th century authors, but the idea that obedience to law is a form of worship and that obedience to human law is thus a form of idolatry, that idea is not new at all. It likewise has a basis in pre-modern Salafism, but more in its legal tradition than in its theology. So here we have another schematic representation of Salafism with respect to law or jurisprudence in Arabic. So as with theology, they purport to derive all of their legal opinions solely from the Quran and from the Hadith. Excuse me, the traditions from the Prophet Muhammad, or Ijma, which I skipped over. The consensus of the Prophet's companions is also considered a source, but there's no real need to go into that right now. Excuse me, I just need some hot water so that I won't be more pleasant for both of us, all of us. Over the course of time, 4 different legal law schools became consecrated as the orthodox ones in Sunnism. The names are not important for the time being. And so Salafis don't always reject the existence of these schools in themselves or say that there's no merit in them, but they reject dogmatic adherence to one in the face of contrary evidence from revelation, from the Quran or from the Sunnah. And that is their rejection of what is known as taqlid, which means to follow the precedents of one's law school or of a particular jurist. Somewhat like the Latin stare decisis, but I'm not a Western legist, so I don't really know. I don't want to go into that. In addition, and in keeping, they also rejected customary law and reject customary law. For example, in Bedouin communities or in Central Asia or South Asia, the Pashtunwali. And in modern times, rejection of modern man-made law, referred to as Qanun Wadi al-Qawanin al-Wad'iyya. Okay, so here we can already see a prefiguration of where I'm going with this. There is one prophetic tradition that has served since the 11th century at the latest. That's the earliest I've been able to trace it. And down to the present day, there is one prophetic tradition in particular that is the foremost proof text grounding the idea that obedience to non-divine law is a form of idolatry, is a form of worship of others apart from Allah. This is an exegetical tradition on Quran 9:31, which states, regarding the Jews and the Christians, they have taken their rabbis and priests as lords apart from Allah, and likewise Jesus, son of Maryam, though they are commanded to worship one God alone, and there is no God but He, gloried be He above what they associate with Him. So the difficulty or the question that naturally arises in relation to this verse is, what does it mean that the Jews and Christians took their rabbis and priests as lords apart from Allah, or alongside Allah, in the place of Allah, however one wants to translate it. And then the verse compares that to the Christian belief in Jesus, son of Mary. So what is the meaning of this accusation that they have taken the rabbis and priests as lords apart from Allah? The tradition I am referring to is an exegetical tradition. That is, it is a hadith, a tradition from the Prophet, but which is relates to this specific verse. And in its most widespread form, it is related by the companion Adi bin Hatim, who was head of the important Tai tribe of southern Arabia. And he was a Christian who converted to Islam and joined the Prophet and his community. So in essence, the exegetical tradition is an account of his conversion. So since this is the center for studies of conversion and so forth, hopefully that is appropriate. So that is the verse. They've taken the rabbis and priests as lords apart from Allah. And do I have the hadith? I do. So here is the story. Adi bin Hatim said, I came to the Prophet of Allah, Allah's blessing and peace be upon him, wearing a golden crucifix on my neck. He, that is the Prophet, said, Adi, cast that idol off your neck. Adi said, so I cast it off. That's the conversion story. Convincing? I don't know. There's a background to it. His sister had already converted to Islam, so apparently by the time he came from the south to meet the Prophet, maybe he was already ready to convert to Islam. Adi said, so I cast it off and came to where the Prophet was as he was reading from Surah Bara, which is another name for chapter 9 of the Quran. He read the verse, they have taken their rabbis and priests as lords in place of Allah. Adi said, I said, O Prophet of Allah, we, that is the Christians, we do not worship them. And the Prophet answered, do they not forbid what Allah permitted, and you permit it? And do they not permit what Allah forbade, and you permit it? Adi said, I said, indeed. The Prophet said, that is worship of them. That is, to receive laws from one's rabbis and priests. That is a form of worship. This is a common theme in the Quran itself, permitting the forbidden, forbidding the permitted, and later in Umayyad intra-Muslim theopolitical discourse and so forth, it is a very major theme in early Islam, at least, in general.
And maybe there's another common theme of converting when you hear the Quran. It's a reaction.
Right. Interesting.
The sound of the Quran.
Wajala kalbuhu, or something like that. Yeah. Indeed. There's a very nice hadith that Ibn Taymiyyah is actually very fond of, with a different companion, Jabir bin Mut'im, if I'm not mistaken, that there's a verse that says, were they created with nothing that created them, or did they create themselves? And Jabir says, if that's his name, I need to look it up. When I heard this verse, I felt my heart splitting open. So yeah, absolutely.
The theme is also that just the mere sound of verses, even if you don't understand them.
Have you ever read Sayyid Qutb's? Have you ever read Sayyid Qutb's artistic depiction in the Quran, Taswir al-Fanni fil Quran? You'll enjoy the introduction there. Thank you. Excellent comments. So this proof text, this tradition, is the principal proof text used in pre-modern Salafi anti-Taqlid polemic. And as I said, I've traced this from the 11th century of the Common Era and up to today. It features in every major work condemning taqlid. That is, works for the most part that are of a Salafi jurisprudential nature. So this was not only condemned, but taqlid, adherence to judicial precedents of one's law school, was condemned as worship of others apart from Allah. And among the authors of these polemics were Ibn Taymiyyah, his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, the founder of the Wahhabi movement, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and other Wahhabis, his Yemeni contemporary, Muhammad al-Shawkani, and scholars from the ranks of the Ahl Hadith, an indigenous Salafi movement that arose in British India in the 19th and 20th centuries. So thus, in the pre-modern Salafi legal tradition, we already find a kind of condemnation of human law and adherence to human law as polytheistic idolatry. Now, in the 20th century, this theme was transposed from its pre-modern home in jurisprudential theory onto the legal political register at the level of the state. In essence, this is a response to a thoroughgoing secularization process of the legal political systems in the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world. Actually, India should be given maybe a larger space in this discussion than it usually receives. But I myself focus on Arabic-speaking world as well. So I don't have time to go into precisely by which channels and so forth. But it's certainly my belief and my conclusion that the pre-modern jurisprudential debate influenced this modern Salafi, and not just Salafi, condemnation of man-made law as polytheism. So here is one example from, I mentioned Abu Alam al-Hudi in India and then Pakistan. This is his Urdu language for basic Quranic terms. One doesn't have to know Urdu to Arabic is enough to see Abi bin Hatim here and the verses here alongside other verses of somewhat general import. So, and this is in English. In these verses, another meaning of ilah is encountered. Excuse me. One that differs entirely from the previous meanings. Here, there is no conception of supernatural power. The one who is taken as an ilah in these verses is either a human or a human's own soul. In this meaning, he is not taken as an ilah when he is supplicated or believed to hold power over benefit and harm or because his protection is sought, but rather he is taken as an ilah in this meaning when his ruling is accepted as law. And when the idea is formed that he in his own right has the authority to command and forbid, it should be, without being obliged to derive authority from and refer back to a power higher than himself. That is, to accord someone the authority to legislate is to take that person as an ilah, that person or that entity. And as for Sayyid Qutb, second passage we're seeing from Sayyid Qutb today, this is an even more famous passage taken from his book Milestones. And it is a passage where he argues that Muslim society no longer exists, that every existing society on earth is a Jahili society, that is, a pagan or a heathen society. And here he writes, Allah, praised be He, ascribed to the Jews and Christians of the past polytheism, unbelief, and straying from exclusive worship of Allah, and the taking of their rabbis and priests as lords in place of Allah, language of the verse, right? Solely because they accorded to the rabbis and priests things which those who call themselves Muslims today accord to people from among themselves. Right? For example, Muslims elect parliaments. It can be a purely Muslim parliament, but that is still to accord them the authority to legislate, and that is to take them as an ilah. So that is a taste of how the template of pre-modern Salafi monolatry is applied to modern-day condemnation of society or government over matters of theonomy, that is, the imperative to rule by God's law alone, and the violation of theonomy is obedience to man-made law instead of Allah's law. Now, this is something that once one sees, one can't unsee it, as they say. Right? Afterwards, once one understands it, it pops up everywhere in modern Salafi writings, especially among radical Salafis, but not only them. For example, sometimes these are referred to respectively as shirk al-qubur, that is the polytheism of tombs or graves, and shirk al-qusur, or the polytheism of palaces, as an autonomy for government. That's one of the popular formulations. But I have glossed over to a certain extent the question from which we began, right? I've always put that off. Is it the societies themselves, the Muslims themselves, who have apostatized? As perhaps one would be given to understand from our first quotation from Sayyid Qutb, or is it just the governments, those who are actually responsible for legislating and instituting man-made law? So those who followed Sayyid Qutb's late doctrine to the letter, as it were, or took it more literally, as I said, Sayyid Qutb was not a trained Muslim scholar, a traditional Muslim scholar. I'm not saying he was ignorant, but he was more of a literary figure. And he was not especially concerned about drawing the jurisprudential boundaries as to who is an apostate and who is not. So these It's a question as to whether to take literally these wide-ranging and somewhat apocalyptic descriptions of the abeyance of Islam from the entire world and the apostasy of the entire world. But there were those who did take it literally and drew judicial determinations, positive judicial determinations from it, and decided that everybody in the world was a non-Muslim apart from themselves. That is, this small group who had the proper interpretation of Sayyid Qutb. There was already also a Salafization process underway. That is, the mainstream Muslim Brotherhood rejected at least the more radical interpretations of Sayyid Qutb, because that was not their traditional ideology. And so Sayyid Qutb's concepts of the kind that we've seen here today really took root after his death, more in the Salafi milieu than within the traditional mainstream Muslim Brotherhood. So there were some somewhat exotic groups that took a very literal interpretation of these dire descriptions of apostasy as having encompassed the entire world. A group called Jamaat al-Muslimin, which means the group of Muslims, because that's how they conceived of themselves. Only they were Muslims, popularly known as the Takfir wal-Hijra. But as I said, they're exotic. Right? They existed in Egypt in the 1970s and early 1980s. And since then, it's been sort of more of that has existed as a kind of temptation or a limit rather than as actual groups that are active in the real world. So that has remained more or less a fringe view. And the more important impact of Qutb's formulations lies in the inspiration they provided for the radical militant Salafi tendencies and organizations. So while Salafism can be quite radical, and I don't need to tell you, right? We're talking about Al-Qaeda, we're talking about ISIS, we're talking about Shabab al-Mujahideen in Somalia, we're talking about these kind of people. So while Salafism can be quite radical, it is, in contrast with Maududi and Qutb themselves, it is beholden to its pre-modern sources. And to put it simply, not everything goes. The language, logic, and parameters of this tradition are respected, and any conclusions that one draws need to be defended in the terms that the tradition set out. And among these is somewhat more caution in declaring people apostates. That is, one cannot just say you're an apostate. There are certain conditions that pertain to applying a general principle to an individual case. And so this varies widely regarding what degree of caution Salafis employ, some more, some less, but at any rate, that always exists. And the Salafization or re-Salafization of this idea can be illustrated through, this is a credo published by Jabhat al-Nusra. You can see the Syrian jihadis here, who are probably now members of the police or something. Jabhat al-Nusra at the time, it was al-Jolani's group back then when it was an official affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria. The credo is called Nubda Ma'na Taqiduhu wa Nadinu Allah Bihi. And I'm not going to translate because I don't think we have that much time. But one can see here that under the category of Tawhid al-Uluhiyya, which is the doctrine I explained earlier from Ibn Taymiyyah, the doctrine of monolatry, one can see the typical Maududi Qutb language here of Tawhid al-Hakimiyya or al-Hakimiyya. That is theonomy. So that entire concept that obedience to man-made law is polytheism was Salafized and embedded very tightly in the Taymiyyan belief system that these Salafis already held. So on the one hand, that is a reason for rather radical insistence on the theme of apostasy and the apostasy of man-made law. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, once one is in a more sober jurisprudential context, then one has to observe the rules. So to make a long story short, even radical Salafis, for the most part, maintain the assumption, the chazakah, we would say in Hebrew, that any given individual in a society that has traditionally, historically been Sunni, that any random individual on the street is to be considered a Muslim unless and until one knows otherwise. And that has important implications. One can eat the meat that they slaughter. You can intermarry. You can pray together with them or behind an imam that one doesn't know. It's known as Mastur al-Hal. Again, it took a while for this. One thinks of like a pinball game, right? It took a while for this to settle down, but that is the presumption that they almost universally adhere to. That does not hold for Shiis. That is a separate issue. And their focus is instead on, first and foremost, on the ruling governments, and especially those bastions of polytheism known as parliaments. From there are concentric circles that descend of increasing apostasy. That is, it's not just the parliament is first and foremost because they are legislating apart from Allah. But then you have an executive who enforces these laws, and you have an army and secret services that support them as well, and so on and so forth, and other supporters. So how wide to draw these circles is also a point of dispute, but the point is that these are concentric circles that expand from the government, and it is not society itself, for all its flaws, that is considered to be apostate per se. And I'll give an example of that last depiction of the concentric circles. There was a debate among Salafi jihadis. All of them agree, the radical Salafis, that is, all of them agree that the Hamas leadership are apostates. Why? Because they participated in elections. They ran in elections. They serve in, I don't know if it actually meets. They serve in the Palestinian Authority Parliament in principle. So they've become Democrats. They're apostates. What does that mean for other members of Hamas? That is, let's say just a random member of the Nukhba or of Kataib al-Qassam, the al-Qassam brigades. Are they an apostate? Opinions differ. And traffic police almost universally are considered not. It doesn't really matter that it's under Hamas. They're just traffic cops. Right? It's also not obeying, it's not polytheistic obedience of man-made law to stop in a traffic light in any country. Because that's not really a law. That's just one is allowed to make simple regulations so that people don't get killed in traffic accidents. But that is a far cry from Bill 1741 of the House and so forth. So everybody agrees that legislation is apostasy. And to bring it back to even more current events, it's clear from what I presented here that if Ahmad al-Shara, if the leader of Syria really intends to hold elections, it's clear that he's no longer a Salafi jihadi. That actually has been clear for some time. That does not necessarily mean anything else. Doesn't necessarily mean anything about his attitude towards Jews or Israel or anything else. It does mean that we can specify more precisely what camp he is in through these kinds of criteria. That's all I have for today. Thank you. Again, I apologize for the coughing. I didn't do anything about it. I'm sorry, say your name again.
Thank you so much for your presentation and also for your book, for your last book. For your new book. Yeah. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
I can also talk a lot about these topics, but it's one of my favorite questions that I want to ask you. You were talking about this strict line between the Hanbali movement, Ibn Taymiyyah, Wahhabiyya, right? So you were talking about the literalism of the Hanbalism. And my question is, if they are so, if they were really rejecting all kinds of allegory, how can it be that Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, one of the most famous let's come back. Okay. I know that there is also another term for monotheism in Islam, Tawhid al-Hakimiyya or Hakimiyya al-Islam. Yeah, I remember this one. Yeah, years of this term. Yeah, so did you meet this?
No, I'll address it. You're asking to address it. The term Hakimiyya?
Tawhid, not just. So I just want to know. So, some kind of places in your books, your studies, where they explain to us what is it. This term is from the 7th century Common Era. So it's
Tawhid or Hakimiyya? That's from the 7th century?
Yeah.
I don't believe so,
Yeah.
but if you have a source, I would be very happy to see it.
was born in
Battle, Sipin?
So, yeah.
That's a word that's like in Tabari or in Baladori or something? Ah. Well, Hokum is
Yeah,
something.
Hokum, that's another story. Yeah.
No, but that's what I know. Well, I'll try to address things. The actual term?
This concept, yeah.
The concepts. The terminology, there's a difference. Well, okay, let me address things one after another. First of all, as for Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, so if you look at the book, then maybe what sparks the question is also that Ibn Taymiyyah is fond of Abdul Qadir al-Jilani and sometimes employs, he wrote a sort of exegesis, a brief little treatise on his Futuh al-Raid. I'm no expert on Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, but I would answer with a question, like a good Jew. Who is Abdul Qadir al-Jilani? Is it Ibn Taymiyyah's Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, or is it the present day Qadiriyas or the medieval Qadiriyas Abdul Qadir al-Jilani? Because those are apparently two very different figures. Who was the historical Abdul Qadir al-Jilani? I don't know, but he's not the only one. Junaid was also a very famous Hanbali Sufi, and I would recommend a number of articles by Christopher Melchert, where he traces the connection between early Hanbalism and early Sufism. It might seem counterintuitive, but it exists. And even, if I'm not mistaken, on the dedication page of Massignon's The Passion of Al-Hallaj, unless it's his technical dictionary of technical terms, but I think it's in the Passion of Hallaj itself, he says something about Hanbalism and Sufism. So it's a well-known issue. As for Hakimiyya and or Tawhid al-Hakimiyya, I would be surprised to find Hakimiyya in a source before Maududi. He coined it in Urdu, this is the best of my knowledge. And it is a calque with a Q, in Hebrew, Targum Bavua, of the word sovereignty in English. Sometimes he even gives the word sovereignty in English as a gloss after the Urdu in English language, in English characters in Latin, in the Latin alphabet. And sometimes he refers to it as a term taken from political theory, or political science. So it really just means sovereignty in Maududi's writings, and it's not really a standalone. So you would say like Hakimiyat Allah or something like that, Hakimiyat Allah, or what have you, to mean God's sovereignty as opposed to human sovereignty. Now in Sayyid Qutb, sometimes it becomes a bit like Hakimiyya, like we hear it today and like it's used today. Somewhat more of a technical term, but that is its origin. As for Tawhid al-Hakimiyya, others have written about this with Muhammad Qutb in Saudi Arabia and stuff like that, and Salafis arguing as to whether it's a fourth form of Tawhid or not. As far as I'm concerned, the third kind of Tawhid is kind of superfluous, what they call the Tawhid of the attributes and the names. Tawhid al-Asma wa-Sifat. Sorry. Because for Ibn Taymiyyah, he doesn't really separate them out. That's already included in Tawhid al-Rububiyyah because it's a description of Allah's objective characteristics in which one is required to believe. It is not the issue of worship. So I think, I can't remember exactly at the moment, but I think Stéphane Lacroix almost certainly and others have written about present day debates as to whether one can say Tawhid al-Hakimiyya or not.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, sure.
I also wanted to ask you, what do you think if we can use some strict monotheism or absolute monotheism referring to the Wahhabiyya Aqidah, right? I see it many times in this picture, strict monotheism, absolute monotheism, because they are so warriors for the true Islam, for the true, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually started from that kind of terminology because, as you say, everybody uses it before I realized more specifically what it was. Because it's not really a question of strict monotheism. It is that as well, but it is first and foremost the issue of monolatry. So, and here I can address more of the Abrahamic. Of course, this is a term that I borrowed from academic study of the Bible, Mikra. Right? And most people use it as to refer to a pre-monotheistic stage of Israelite religion that is hypothesized to have existed, and I think it's probably right. I don't know. It's not my field. But I was very influenced by one article by Yoshua Amir, who was a scholar of Hellenistic Judaism and translator of Philo of Alexandria, among other things. And he argued that we should put aside this idea of monolatry as just a preliminary stage of Israelite monotheism, because it was and remained the heart of biblical religion. It was always about monolatry more than it was about monotheism. Whether the other gods are said to kind of exist in some sense or not, it wasn't an ontological question. It was a question of faith and devotion. So that is why there's nothing wrong with strict monotheism, but I find this to be much more specific. And if you read Ibn Abdul Wahhab himself, I mean, I think it's new for everybody. Nobody else in Islamic studies talks like that, as far as I know. They should.
What last?
Oh, is there a question from the Zoom?
Nimrod?
Which Nimrod Orbit? I'd be happy to. I knew he was here. I would have prepared more carefully.
הוא לא פה. אולי אוכל לשאול דרך הטלפון שלו.
כנראה ירד. Demons. The Vimis, I'm sorry. Not much different. I mean, they reject all of the modernist constructions, of course. It would have to be something like the medieval, all the Vima. In principle, at least. I still have never heard of one that's actually married to a Jewish woman or a Christian woman, which in principle would have to be permitted. That's a good question. And actually one of the books that I've never really looked into of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah is the Ahkam al-Dhimma. So I assume that that's more influential than other writings among them. But I can't say that I really know. And maybe it's not by chance that I don't really know, because what has always fascinated me about these people and these topics is, or sort of what is unique about them is their views on other purportedly Sunni Muslims. So views on the Shia and on other non-Muslims, they have their interest in probably some of their own yichud, some of their own. It's a good question that needs to be looked into. But to be honest, I've never really dealt with those topics in depth, except for a little bit the Nusayri Alawis in Syria.
Did anyone ever question and say, okay, they put the Christian and the Jews, they put their rabbis like Did anyone ever question what about the imam? Like, don't you say more something? Was there ever
That was
verse about it?
that's what they meant. It wasn't. So the verse itself is presumably, at least on its face, a polemic against Jews and Christians. Already from the Umayyad era, as far as I can tell, it was used more in intra-Muslim debates, this theme and the tradition. So the issue of taqlid, what they call taqlid of the law schools, it's actually entirely about the Muslim imams. They aren't really, it's taken as a given that the Jews and the Christians have corrupted revealed religion, saying at least Muslims shouldn't do the same. That's the basic idea. Now, as for what the original accusation was, with the Jews, it's pretty clearly the oral law. This continues anti-rabbinic polemic from Jewish sects, whether in the Second Temple period or later. With the Christians, it's a little bit, it's a widespread theme. What it means precisely is maybe a little bit less clear.
A lot of emphasis on the monarchy, which is very helpful because it's much more meaningful than to say radical or strict. But would you agree that the really what is special to those groups or this worldview is the fear, is and it's such a far cry from medieval Sunni Islam, which was very careful in claiming that others apostatized, very careful in from the full implications of cherem, or right, because we were talking about cherem. So it's denouncing someone as an apostate or as a non-Muslim, as you said, has very grave consequences. And it's the way
we didn't even talk about the obligation to kill them.
Right.
Among other things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if they're apostates, then they deserve one needs to terminate them. So, and that medieval Sunni Islam or mainstream Sunni Islam is very, very careful.
Indeed. I would say this about Ibn Taymiyyah, as I know him at least. He was likewise careful on all of these same issues. That is, an Ash'ari, which was the predominant school of Sunni theology in the Arabic-speaking world up until the 20th century, to some extent less so these days, an Ash'ari was not an apostate. He likes to cite, Ahmad ibn Hanbal on that score, who said about the Jahmiyyah, which is what Ibn Taymiyyah calls Ash'aris, but the Jahmiyyah, strictly speaking, were a more explicitly Neoplatonist sect in the Umayyad era. And so Ahmad bin Hanbal, he likes this statement by Ahmad bin Hanbal that if they knew what I knew, then they would be apostates, but they don't know. Right? There's margin for error in doctrine. Where Ibn Taymiyyah is very unique, and when one sees that more, whether it's a correct application of Ibn Taymiyyah or not is a separate question, but one sees that even more. It is certainly based on Ibn Taymiyyah in the Wahhabi movement and in modern Salafism. It's not about creed or aqidah, it's about acts, so there's an entire other topic, which was the topic of my first book, on the relation between acts and faith in Muslim theology and the interrelation between that issue and present-day Salafi radicalism of the kind we've been talking about. So yes, they are equally reticent to declare takfir for ideas, and much more willing to do so for acts that they consider to be worship of not Allah.
Yeah, there was a big discussion in the Sunni Islam, the bigger scene, the lesser scene. Yeah, right.
I'm sorry?
The biggest scene.
The Kabira and the Sarira, yeah. Right, so in keeping with that, please, I'm sorry.
Somebody can get there were Muslim
Theologians
saying that somebody committed a bigger sin, so he's no longer Muslim, right? And you can do with him everything you want, right? But the Ashari theologians, they say that it's not correct. Yes, that there is a principle in between. Yeah, he Mabena, he committed a big sin, but he's still a Muslim, and we don't know what his fate will be in the future, in the afterlife.
Okay, so this is the exactly I thought. Right, except that Ibn Taymiyyah agrees with that, and the Salafis agree with that as relates to the Kabira, not the part of his, his fate is completely unknowable. That's more of an Ashari, or what they would consider to be a Morji principle. But everybody, including Al-Qaeda, and to the best of my understanding, also ISIS, none of them declare apostasy because of Kabiras, Kaba'ir. That is murder, what's it called? Sexual relations, fornication or what have you. So they are traditional Sunnis in that sense. Where they differ from the Asharis is in what about acts that are not just a Kabira, right? So bowing down to an idol presumably is something worse than a Kabira. Or perhaps ruling by man-made law is something worse than a Kabira. Well, before you have any closing ritual that you have, thank you to everybody. I very much appreciate your presence and your questions.
Thank you.
כן, אני עוסק בנושאים הללו במשך 20 שנה, because גם אותי זה מרתק, פשוט אני אוהב מאוד לעסוק בתחומים הללו. התחומים שאני הרציתי עליהם, הזרם הסלפי, ויש שם עומק, הם לא חבר'ה נחמדים, יש שם עומק שזה תענוג לצלול לתוכו.
אני לא אומר על האקדמיה, בציבור הישראלי לא מספיק מכירים אותם.
כן.
זה מאוד סטריאוטיפי.
נכון.
כל דברים שהם מאוד דומים באמת.
אם כי אם אנשים כמוני לא הסבירו את זה עדיין מספיק לציבור, אז אני לא בא בטענות לציבור. איפה הם אמורים אותם.
יש מספיק פודקאסטים וזה, אבל אנשים לא, זה לא מספיק. גם ההשוואות האלה, אתה יודע.
גם שבארץ הם היו ועדיין עוד רלוונטיים מאשר חמאס, שהוא ארגון בת של האחים המוסלמים. שמעתי זה יותר רלוונטי לפילוגים או מחלוקות פנים מוסלמיות, שזה גם קצת יותר נחמד לעסוק בהם, כי זה לא יושב לי פה על הגרון מהחיים עצמם, או לא יותר מדי.
תודה רבה.
תודה לכם על ההזמנה.
למדתי הרבה.
לבד למדת הרבה, אז אולי יצטרך לעשות משהו. תודה רבה, דניאלה.
וואו, מזל שזה לא נמשך יותר.